We'd like to welcome you to this webinar today. My name is Bill Baker. I'm with Firestorm in Atlanta. It's an absolutely gorgeous day here in Atlanta. Hope you're having good weather wherever you may be. Today we're having a crisis conversation. This is the 6th in the 2016 series of the RenWeb sponsored Crisis Coach webinars. We'd also like to have you as our friend. On Facebook, we're Firestorm Solutions. On Twitter, you can follow us on Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risks and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We'd also like to remind you that the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and this work product should be discussed in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. Do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is delighted to have this webinar series underwritten by the good people at RenWeb. They've been our sponsor for a number of years now in this Crisis Coach webinar series. You can go to firestorm.com and watch past webinars in this series, and you can register for future webinars. We have them once a month.
And Bill, I think I'll jump in and talk about RenWeb for a second. I don't think Scott could be with us at the last minute today. But we're very excited to continue sharing information with our RenWeb schools. By the way, there are well over 4,000 of you now, and so that's such a significant portion. And if Scott was here, he would thank you for what you've been doing, and he would probably want to also remind you that there is a user conference coming up in Miami in July. So that's a RenWeb user conference, and there's a great opportunity there to network with your peers and then get additional training on some of the things that we're talking about today and other topics, and a variety of speakers and breakout sessions. So if you haven't attended a RenWeb user conference, I would strongly encourage you to do so. It's a unique opportunity. Well, I'm Jim Satterfield. I'm president and founder of Firestorm, and certainly glad to be with you this month and talking about and having this crisis conversation. Our initial idea around the conversation today was that it was a kind of a mid-year check. Where are we? What have we been seeing in terms of crises that have impacted schools during the year so far? What are we concerned about as we look forward? So it gives us a chance to zero in on those thoughts at this point. And you've seen us many times talk about what is your next crisis? Can you identify that? And you'll see there we say we can, and I think we'll share some thoughts around that. Now, across the bottom there, you see a line through a bunch of words: sexual molestations, violence, racism, compliance. We've seen all of those things already this year appearing in our schools and dealing with those. But the next crisis we're going to see probably won't be one of those. It'll be how you respond to the crisis that you're in. And looking at that, that's important for us to think about. And today, we want to give you some direction and thoughts to maybe organize your plans on what you're going to communicate, how you're going to effectively handle the critical decisions that you must make in that area. So, unfortunately, we see a great deal of challenges in front of our schools, and today we want to try to help you frame some of the things that you would need to say and do. So where are we? One of the things that happens in a crisis is that you don't have any time. If you don't prepare in advance, you don't have the ability to optimize what your conversations will be, what your communications and your message exiting into the marketplace. Now, years ago, we used to talk about the golden hour in a crisis. You could meet with your outside legal counsel. You could talk to your board. You could get your senior leadership in your school and come together and say, this is what we need to do. But today it's happening instantly. Somebody's putting this up on YouTube. There's emails going out. Information is flowing. And you're going to need to be able to communicate with your schools, students and parents at the critical element as this crisis evolves. So wherever we can, we want to identify what could cause a crisis before it actually escalates. That's where you've heard us talk about the behavioral risk threat assessment and identifying those behaviors of concern before they can escalate to violence. You've heard us discuss having an intelligence network to see what's being said, and that's much more than just a Google search. But waiting until the crisis occurs to try to figure out what you're going to do is just simply too late. You're going to need to be able to be prepared before that event occurs. Now, we've seen a great many things this week about Muhammad Ali and reminding us of the roles that he's played in his life. And when I think about Muhammad Ali, I always think about what he was saying. And he said it with both his words and his actions in many respects and was quite effective across those. But I had never seen the quote that you see on the screen now. Silence is golden when you can't think of a good answer. I would tell you that's the best piece of advice to think about in a crisis. Regularly we'll respond to a school and they'll find themselves in a crisis and someone on their board is saying, we need to get this information out, we need to get in front of it, we need to frame it, and start to carry you along. Almost everything you learn initially in a crisis is wrong. You're going to be forced to make decisions based upon wrong information. So slowing this process down, and we're going to talk a lot about that today, becomes extremely important. So if you can't think of a good answer, don't say. And better yet, don't even get into the point of having a conversation with the media until you're prepared to do so. So as we think through this, how do the schools survive a crisis? Now, you spent a lot of time establishing, here's our curriculum, here's how we're going to make sure that we manage our teachers, and here's our sports aspects, and all the things that we're doing within our schools. You've laid out very detailed plans around that. Well, you also need to have plans of how you make decisions when something goes wrong. And as a general rule, we've always stated that if you're explaining, you're losing. That's an important element for us to focus on in this crisis environment to make sure that we've addressed every one of those things. So there are operational planning requirements in a crisis, just like you would in planning a school. Now, you made a decision on how you're going to operate your school with RenWeb. They provide great software and to run your school and your operation. You're just not doing this on the fly. Well, a crisis, unfortunately, we know you're going to be faced with those elements to have to make decisions. I met a head of school this past week at the Georgia Independent School Association who we had worked with during the year. Her school had had 5 crises during the year, and we'd worked together on those, and it was the first time I had a chance to meet her face to face. You need to have this plan in advance or it's going to become a particular problem. So why is this plan needed? Well, your school's reputation, their brand, you don't want to be known as the school where this occurred or where that was badly handled associated with it. And everyone wants to know, what do we say, what do we do at these various points? Once you take and make a statement that later turns out to be not correct or completely wrong, you're going to find that that will make it very difficult for you as you think about what's happening within your school and building the type of brand and reputation. So why do we need this plan? Well, because there will be impacts, and every crisis is a human crisis. You have care, custody, and control over someone's son or daughter. You don't want to be in a point that you have to think about what would happen in this particular scenario. So having your plan makes the best difference in the entire action. So every time there's an event, there is a reaction that will be continually played over and over. And so when we talk about crisis management, it's really not crisis management, it's consequence management. What is going to be the impact on my school What's going to be the impact on my students, on my teachers at this point in time? And so if we can predict what the vulnerabilities and threats are, have plans in place to address those, and in wherever possible, even prevent them, then we're monitoring to see if they're occurring and then update that plan as we start to perform. So this is the environment that we find, and unfortunately this year so far in 2016, these are exactly the scenarios that we've seen unfold in school crises today. So you want to know, can I make this thing stop? And it would be nice if we had one of those buttons that we could push and go back in time before the crisis occurred, before the fire or the flood or the shooting. But what you do in the first minute, and in particular the first hour in a crisis, will determine the severity of that event for your people, your school, your board, your brand, your reputation. If you take the wrong action or make the wrong statement, it's going to make this significantly worse. So you probably are saying, okay, I get it, Jim. How do I stop that process? So what I would encourage you to do is we're going to think about that today and give you some tools to begin to address it. And we're going to talk about a program called Crisis Stop that you have immediate access to that could prove to be a benefit. Now, what happens in a crisis is immediately the adrenaline starts to flow. People are trying to rush through. Lots of people have got ideas of what needed to be done and what needs to be said. The first thing that I would encourage you to do is to slow the process down. There's a rush immediately to try to get something done, and people accelerate their activities. They talk faster. They talk louder. What can you do? Well, the first thing I would encourage you to do is to speak quietly. While everyone is around you gets hyper and is raising their voice, if you will physically just tone your voice level down, that will start to be a calming influence here, and that will help them have time to reflect on what needs to be done. In addition to lowering your voice, I would encourage you to slow your speech. That is another way to have people take a deep breath and figure out what they need to think about and do at those points. So your first goal in any crisis is to get people reflecting what would be the consequences of this. How do we need to look at those types of things to be able to handle it? Mistakes are always made in a crisis. You're going to be forced to choose between bad options. Here's a bad choice. Here's a bad choice. We're going to have to do one of those, and recognizing that there are impacts associated with those choices. So that's where the monitoring and adjusting are coming through. It's not going to be a situation that we can make whatever caused the crisis go away as if it had never occurred. But being calm in those areas will make an important difference. So we've developed an acronym that will help you, and it's using the letters out of STOP to think about it. And by the way, Firestorm has your back. Will help you in this particular area as a result of your RenWeb relationship. So you slow this process and control the panic, identify what the concerns are, provide direction, and then lay the foundation for how you're going to manage the consequences of these on your school. So the acronym STOP stands for stabilize the situation, trigger the appropriate responses, opine on the exposures, and prevent common crisis errors. And we'll share a bunch of those with you today as we continue our conversation. So let's look at each one of those four elements individually, and then we'll come back as a group to look at it in its entirety. By the way, the Firestorm Crisis Stop program means that if you find yourself in a crisis, call. We'll do the first hour of consultation with you at absolutely no cost, no obligation, because having those outside eyes and ears will make a significant difference in terms of what happens. So how do you stabilize the situation? It's the act of just stopping it. Slow those events down so that you have a time to think about it. the tips that I gave you earlier about slowing your speech, lowering your voice, and let people see that we need to have a reasonable plan. We've got to focus on what does that mean so that we're not rushing a press release out. We're not picking up the phone and calling the media. And I will tell you later, as we've told you and the others, you know how to reach your students. You know how to reach your teachers. You know how to reach your parents. So you will always be able to communicate directly without having to go through a third party like the media. So the first goal is just to stop this process, slow it down, and get everybody in a calmer, lower voice level, slower speech pattern. And one thing that happens in that environment, if you're quieter, if you're speaking, others will mimic what you are doing, and that's an important tool that you've at least begun the stabilization process. Once we've done that, we need to figure out what do we need? What are the resources that we need? Internally, externally, do we need to be talking to our outside counsel that supports our school? What legal insights would they give us? We've found in every situation that when a crisis occurs, people generally call two individuals. One, their attorney, the other, their insurance broker, because in many of these cases, there is insurance to protect the school in those situations. But what you want to do is, what are those resources that we need? Let's get them coordinated, and we'll talk about the types of communications that need to develop in just a few moments. So you want to identify those resources, get them involved, so that you can have the best outcome. So we first stabilized, stopped it, slowed it down. Now we want to start getting our resources involved. And they're going to help us now do the third step, and that's opine. What does this mean? Some of our choices we can figure out, others are not. And what we're doing, as I described, that we're choosing between bad options. Now, when I was a child, I kid about my grandfather having a phrase, which would you rather have, or a whipping? Well, you know what? That's fairly easily as a child to go, I think I'll take the non-whipping option, please. But in a crisis, you're going to be forced to make decisions with limited, inaccurate information, and information that's just plain out wrong. So that's why you want to stop before you act. Think about what my resources are, and then say, what are the consequences if I take this action? If I make this action, what would that mean? Because once you've done it, you can't, in many cases, ever pull that back. It's like ringing a bell. Once you've rung the bell, that sound is out there, and we want to be prepared in that direction. Now, finally, the last letter in STOP is P. You're trying to prevent making some of the basic mistakes that every time that happens in a crisis, we receive repeated over and over. The italics right there in the middle is that when you're explaining, you're losing. If you find yourself in a situation where you're telling a student, or you're telling a parent, or you're telling the media, well, look, the reason why this happened is this, you are losing. You're talking on the wrong subject. We've shared with you what you should be talking about, that you would, 1, not be defined by the event, 2, that you will invent the future, and 3, that you'll embrace the family. So when you think about that, whatever happened, we're not talking about. You legally can't talk about something that happened with one child to another parent. There's confidentiality issues associated with it. Parents wouldn't want you talking about their child to a third party. So when this event occurs, that's not what your school is about. It's not about the shooting. It's not about the sexual molestation. It's not about the sexting. It's not about the cyberbullying. What our school is about is, and then look at your mission statement. Look at what it says on your website, and the culture and the ethics that you're teaching within your school. The second is, what are you going to do to make your school the safest place? What I can tell you is, we're going to put a program in place to make sure that every student is safe. But it's really not about who we are and what we've done or what we will do. It's about our children. It's about our students that are involved. And that's what our focus is right now. Those are safe grounds. Isn't that much better than saying no comment? And these other mistakes that we're talking about, talking to the media in a crisis or immediately after a crisis is a mistake. You can 100% of the time find a way to talk directly to your students, directly to your teachers, or directly to your parents. And that's what we would encourage you to do. You do not want to put out an announcement. We are dealing with an organization, and something that's happened recently that you might want to be aware of. In many states, the state legislatures have changed the statute of limitations rulings on reporting, particularly related to sexual molestation. And we're seeing camps and schools being sued for events that happened 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago to come up now by the removal of that statute of limitations. So one of the things that you have to be aware of is what you're saying and how that will mean and how that will come into play at each step along the way. So there are bigger implications at each step along the way. So what we want you to do here are to avoid these common mistakes as they would come through. So why communicate? We've talked about this at many times, but if you find yourself in a crisis and someone says, you know, we need to frame this issue, we need to get out in front of it, I want you to stop and ask them why, and then repeat that why 5 times. So if someone says, well, we need to do this, and you go, why? And they give you an explanation, then you say, why? They give you another explanation, you say, why? And until you're convinced that we definitely need to communicate now, don't communicate. In the first 24 hours, the communications are very critical, and you're going to find that the information will turn out not as it's been presented to you. That's why you have to be very careful with any communications in those first 24 hours. And so you have to weigh the value of that communication against the liability that's been created. We just were recently helping a school with sexual molestation issues that occurred. And they were going to make a statement, and then the facts suddenly changed. And if they had made the first statement, they would have had a significant problem that they wouldn't have needed to have. All right, you're in the crisis. Something is happening. What do you need to do? How do you develop a strategy of what our actions are and what our words are? Well, first, think about the strategy questions that you need answers to. What occurred? Now, when you're getting a report of what occurred, who's telling you? Has it been verified? Is this a source that you can trust and you think it's an accurate perception? And it's always important to keep the focus on what it is that you know, not what you think. Many times people report what they think as a fact, when in fact it is not. You then also start to shift mentally into focusing on what's going to happen next, because what that gets us into the consequence area that we talked about. What are you concerned about? What really, is it immediate safety of students? Is it this getting out into the media? Is it some other situation that might be discovered? Focus on what it is you're concerned about. What is your plan? How are you going to monitor? And in particular, in today's world, we're talking about monitoring not only the reactions of people and what's occurring, but looking at traditional media and social media. Social media drives traditional media. You need to be there first, looking at those elements to be prepared. What are the metrics? How do you know if you're doing a good job? That's an important element, because our focus is always at Firestorm, how do we transform this crisis into value? Because it can make a significant difference within your school. What are your 3 key messages? And I gave you the not defined by the event, invent the future, embrace the families. You take those themes, convert them into your words relative to your situation. Generally, we would not put a spokesperson out, and we would never put out the head of school as the initial spokesperson. Why would that not be the case? Well, if the facts could be wrong, then we're in a situation where we're hurting the credibility of the very person that we need to be able to talk at some point. And if you have a spokesperson, person, you need to have 2 backups identified, because what could happen is they could be out that day, there could be other problems associated with it. You need to be prepared in this particular scenario to respond. As you think about looking at these elements, we want you to be set and have them trained. When someone says, I don't need media training, that's probably the very person that you need to have that meeting training. What are your threats and vulnerabilities that your school faces overall, and in particular you're facing at this point in time? That's an important area to focus on. Who are the internal and external parties? Do they have agendas? Is there someone that's coming that's got a vendetta against you or the school or the student or the coach? How do we deal with those elements? One of the things, if you bring in an outside resource, and I would always encourage you to have an experienced crisis manager to assist you, because they don't have the emotional connection that you would have at those points, and they can be a little bit of a dispassionate third party. You want to make sure that you try to have them retained through your legal counsel in contemplation of litigation. There will be litigation in these events. And think about what records that you created and how those would be retained. So if we move from that, as we're getting that information in and those questions, it comes into the strategy. And strategies are both communications and action. We're establishing what happened. That's an action that we need to do. We need to be able to know what happened. Who are the key contacts that could give us the insights of that? Do we have witnesses involved in it? What is the risk and vulnerability that we have now? How do we have command and control of our school and our location? Because many times those things are lost. The social media that we talked about earlier. Who are brand supporters? Who's supporting our school? And who is a detractor here? You will have to conduct an investigation. Do you have a standard set of procedures and policies? If you might want to look at the BERTHA program, Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment Program, that Firestorm has available. By the way, we will be doing a session on that at the July user conference for RenWeb. And there's a program that lays out, gives you the forms, provides the training for your threat assessment team, and empowers you to be able to deal with it. Identify all the stakeholders, your initial messages, monitor, identify the spokesperson, the communications and training. You may need to set up a call center. We had to set up a call center at Virginia Tech after the shootings there, because if you have a mass casualty event, the school will be inundated with calls. We have the ability to stand that up in 45 minutes after an event for you. Identify future needs. Very seldom, if ever, would we encourage you to do a press conference. That is generally an issue that we want to always avoid at every step along. What's your move forward plan? How are you going to update everyone that's working on your team at that point? Now, when you're thinking about crisis communications, and we'll focus on that side because that's an area that is certainly something that you can have direct input and control on in this crisis situation. We, in all of our plans, look at 5 separate phases. Pre-action, what are you doing beforehand? Onset, what are you doing the moment that it occurs? Impact assessment, how bad is it? How do we respond and how do we recover? And then finally, the post-crisis phase. So if you look at it, you now have an outline of what you need to be doing. Right now, looking at your vulnerabilities and threats. What keeps you up at night? What do you need to have messages prepared for on those subjects? And so you lay out these message maps to do those elements. Recognizing the onset communications, and we'll talk about the 3 types of C, but here's generally going to be coordination, and we'll be looking at things like evacuate, shelter in place, lockdown, lockout, getting those information out as quickly as we possibly can. The assessment, how bad is it, is going to make a big determination of what happens. What do we need to do to respond and recover? And then finally, a review of everything that occurred to determine how can we do better? What should we have had in place that we didn't? And how did people respond to the messages that we sent out during the crisis? So the 3 C's of crisis communication, always the first communication in a crisis is one of coordination. We focus initially internally, getting our students in our classrooms. Are we sheltering in place? Are we locking down? Are we locking out? Are we evacuating? Obviously, you could have some communications with law enforcement or fire or medical incoming in, but the first communication in any crisis is a coordination communication. The next communication is more critical from the brand and reputational impact. The coordination up above is generally a life safety coordination. The crisis communications addresses the impacts that would happen. We would probably delay most of those communications not in that first day and first moments. We'll be talking about that in the next 24 to 48 to 72 hours, not at the immediate onset of the crisis. The last will be a compliance communications. Now, sometimes compliance becomes before crisis in that, as you know, you're a designated reporter. You're going to have to report any opportunity that you see for a child to be at risk or in danger. If you learn that there was violence in the home, or that you had a student who was contemplating suicide, or if there were other potential threats. And one of the things that we found in the suicide investigation is there's generally a kill list because the person who feels that they have no choice but to take their own life wants to set the score even with others. And now they've identified other students or teachers that they want to take out before the police take them out in that area. So think about who you'd have to notify and coordinate. So if you're building a communications plan, where do you start? Well, you follow the Predict.Plan.Perform process that Firestorm has referenced in most of our webinars today. First, predict who's the audience and what are they concerned about. What do my parents need to know? What do my students need to know? What do my teachers need to know? And our comments will be consistent, but in the language we use and what we choose to share will vary by the audience that we're delivering the message to. Tailor that message, the messenger and the media or medium that you're going to use to send it for each one of those stakeholder groups. Because how we talk about to a first grader about an event could be radically different than how we talk to a teacher about an event. And then finally, focus on your 3 key messages. You're not going to be able to make a speech to last an hour. You're not going to be able to write a book and send it out to people. It has to be concise. It has to frame those messages quickly. And again, if you're stuck and you don't know what you can say, go back to those. Will not be defined by the event, will invent the future, and will embrace the family. That is a safe harbor for you in developing messaging. We just talked with a school who'd had a problem that essentially the bookkeeper walked out with the money. And now you've got a situation of what do I say, and when do I say it, and how do we communicate those things. So the actions don't necessarily have to be only violence oriented. So kind of put this in a framework. What do you have and what do you need? The what do you have concept, there's a fast food restaurant that was started in the 30s in the Atlanta area called the Varsity. It's a hamburger place that used to have car hops on the cars and an opportunity to go there. And as you go through the line to get your meal, the person behind the counter is going, what do you have? What do you have? If you wanted a hot dog then to go, they would say 2 dogs walking. So you got to always focus on what you have and then what do you need. The 2 columns on the left are a list of the actions that Firestorm would see that you would need to take in the crisis as it unfolds. And in fact, those are the areas that we would help in those particular ones. But these are things that you should start thinking about. What you do in those 2 blue columns will determine about what your next crisis is and how you respond. As we've said in the earlier suggestions on the questions and the actions, you've got to analyze the event. You've got to establish a baseline of what information is outside of the school. What does the media have? You want to start to coordinate communications. You don't want to have teachers speaking. You don't want to have others reaching out and engaging. You need to develop the messages and the message maps in response to the event. And maybe in some cases there's a message that we will go out with that will preempt those measures. Media training for anyone that's going to interface within the media environment. And intelligent solution. We encourage you to monitor social media. And that's divided into two parts. One is a part of listening, and another is a part of looking. Listening is looking for words and streams and phrases. Looking is looking at an individual or a location or an event. And we can see what communications are coming from and going to. We can even go back in time if you set up a geofence in the look aspect to see who that individual was talking to last Thursday and the Thursday before. We can also identify with that the sphere of influence. Who else are they talking with? It is critical in today's environment that you understand what's going on in social media as a key. Two statistics that we cite on a regular basis is if someone has ill intent, 80% of the time, someone else knows. And 67% of the time, two or more people know, and that becomes a foundation then for looking at what's being said. And when people know, they talk on social media. Conduct your risk, vulnerability, and threat assessment of what's going to happen now so that you understand that will drive both your action and your communications. What's our strategy? We have to have a strategy on how we're going to deal with this particular event. You want to engage in brand and business recovery. How quickly can we get the school back operationally? How can we make sure that our brand isn't known as this particular area? I have shared with you, I think, in earlier webinars that 3 years ago, Firestorm worked with a college, a state college, where there was cannibalism. Now, you might say, gee, I didn't hear anything about it, and I would say thank you at that point. But the key element is, had that school gone out and conducted a press conference, had they done a variety of other things, they would be known, and it's always associated with the word cannibalism. Certainly not what you're looking for. You've got to maintain the confidence in your students, in your parents, in your teachers. You want to minimize legal risk. You will be involving both your legal counsel and your insurance in this market. And there's a variety of now new insurance products that can help you in addressing sexual molestation and deadly weapons. Compliance review, looking at have we notified everybody we needed to notify? Have we met all the requirements that we in fact have at this point in time? Who are some of the other partnerships? Is there another school that you can call on? Is there a state association? You need to have some assistance, and that could even go with the next. The Firestorm Crisis Stop program can provide you that assistance initially. And then finally, a disengagement strategy. How do we wind this crisis down? How do we get back to normal? And I will tell you, after a crisis or an event, it was likely be a new normal in making those plans. So my goal today was to say, look, let's have a conversation about what we're seeing. Already this year, we've seen violence. We have seen sexual molestation. We've seen sexting. We've seen suicide. We've seen cutting. We've seen almost every the fraud situations with theft included in it. You will be facing a crisis sometime within your school. At the moment it occurs is not the time that you should stop and think about, well, I wonder if we should have a plan. Today is that day to start thinking about it. Now, when we think about how people do in a crisis, we always have a maturity model, and this is the maturity model that we look at. You should think about those factors along the left-hand side: decision process, roles and responsibilities, information clarity, speed of decision-making, and communications effectiveness. Those are the most important elements for you to think about in managing this crisis. And we move from everything being a liability, that's a stage one, it's coming as a surprise, I often say that the last time the surprise was good, I was 5 and it was my birthday. To it's basic. We still are in a reacting mode. We've got some of these things in place. Third is the third stage would be a better advanced. It's pre-action. We've got some of the structure in place and some clear opportunities. But ultimately in your school, you want it to become a strategic part of your culture. Now, all of you are proud about your school and where you are. Academically, the values that you enhance, and I'm sure that there's no one on our call today who doesn't feel like that they're in the top quartile of the top 10% of schools in those areas. Now, we regularly will assess a school from a planning standpoint. Where are they relative to standards and best practices? The average score across private schools and independent schools is 50%. They're only halfway there. Well, if the average score from an academic standpoint in your school was 50, I think you'd be upset. I think you'd want to say, what do we need to do to get on track to meet those requirements? So this is a continuous improvement process that I would encourage you to think about. You do that by following the Predict, Plan, Perform methodology, understanding your vulnerabilities and threats, understanding their impact, understanding how you would monitor them, and the triggers that would activate your plan. You would also then want to make sure you have policies and procedures. How do we identify behaviors of concern before they rise to violence? Looking at things like communicable illness, and sexting and other issues within your school. Look at then how you perform the supplies, the training, the monitoring, the intelligence network. Now, as we move beyond that, we think about what are the next steps that we can do. Establish an intelligence network. If you haven't done that, that's a great beginning point. Then you're going to have earlier knowledge of what's going on and what the reactions are. Second, develop a crisis communications with a message map. What are you going to say at each step along the way? And then perform. I would recommend you think about having a communications audit, looking at what your messages are, how the messages would be approved, and putting in place. If you need, we can certainly do that for you. I would strongly encourage you to attend the RenWeb User Conference in July. Great opportunity to network with your peers and a chance to sit through training sessions around crisis communications, behavioral risk threat assessment, go through an exercise of making decisions in a crisis there, and you'll get a chance to benchmark your plans. There is next week on Tuesday at 2 o'clock Eastern a virtual exercise, and many of you have participated in those that we've done this year, on communicable illness, and we're going to be looking at Zika. So this gives you an opportunity to talk about what decisions do we need to make, are we ready to do that, and it's a chance for you to put your crisis team, your emergency team, your safety security team around a table and talk about how do we make these decisions, what decisions do we need to make. By the way, we already have over 400 organizations set up to attend that exercise on Tuesday, June 14th at 2 p.m. And then contact us and join the Behaviors of Concern user group, and that's that behavioral risk threat assessment program to identify. What else you can do is you can get the brief associated with today's webinar. It's crisis conversation. You can go to firestorm.com/brief and you can look at it. By the way, you can also listen to the webinar again or have others in your organization look at the webinar at that time on demand. Our thanks go out today to RenWeb and all of the support that they're giving our schools every single day and being able to run their school and run it effectively. And it's a great service that's performed by RenWeb. If you've got questions, you can go to firestorm.com and register for future events. Download the white papers. You can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com if you have questions, or pick up the phone and call us at 800-321-2219 if you have questions. We're going to try to reach out to everyone on the call today to answer those questions. We look forward to meeting you, hopefully face-to-face in July at the RenWeb conference. But we hope you don't find yourself in crisis. If you do, call Firestorm. Our Crisis Stop program will help you in that first hour of a crisis at no cost to your school. Thanks, and have a wonderful day. We hope you have a great spring and a great summer, and we'll be talking with you some over the summer. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.